The shock came from outside, but it hit Beijing's showcase of strength head-on. On April 22, 2026, what Iran did to China really seems insane, because without hitting Beijing with a missile, the crisis exploded at the most sensitive point of Xi Jinping's model. Cheap oil, a safe route, and factories running non-stop. And when I talk about Chinese impotence, and that's the image that's growing now, Xi Jinping was truly left without an answer for the astronomical losses he's experiencing right now during the Iran crisis with the United States. Especially because of two cargo ships already seized by the powerful United States Navy, which are directly connected to China. China's industrial base is already feeling the devastating impact of this war. I'm going to tell you all about this, but now you'll want to be subscribed to the channel to stay well informed, information and real-time updates with the best journalistic quality you've ever seen. Trust me, Milson Alves. What happened was direct and brutal. Since the beginning of the war, on February 28th, the tension around the Strait of Hormuz has reached the heart of global energy trade. This passage is one of the most vital on the planet. When it gets blocked, the impact hits Asia first, which relies heavily on Middle Eastern oil. And China is at the center of this dependence. Even with state-owned refineries, reserves, and maneuvering capacity, Beijing saw the risk rise too quickly to keep pretending it was shielded. Chinese diplomacy started calling for restraint and rejecting any blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. Who's at the center of this earthquake? On one side, Iran, which has become the military, energy, and logistics focus of the crisis. On the other side, China, the world's largest oil importer and the dominant buyer of Iranian oil transported by sea. Data gathered by Reuters shows that in 2025, China bought more than 80% of the oil shipped by Iran, averaging 1.38 million barrels per day. This accounted for about 13.4% of all the oil China imported by sea. That's the key to the story. Beijing wasn't using Iranian oil as a supplement, it was using it as a strategic crutch to keep costs low, margins tight, and exports competitive. Where does this hit show up first? In Shandong, at the independent refineries known as teapots. They were the ones buying cheaper oil, processing it quickly, and supplying an important part of the Chinese industrial machine. For years, Iranian oil arrived with a discount of up to $8 to $10 per barrel compared to Brent. That made all the difference for those who live on thin margins. But after the war, that advantage evaporated. In April, Chinese refineries started paying a premium of $1.5 to $2 above Brent for Iranian cargoes, something almost unthinkable not long before. What was once a cushion became a squeeze. What seemed like a smart move turned into dependence. How does this shock reach the factory floor? It comes through the cost of refining, transportation, plastic, fuel, and production costs. At the end of March, Reuters reported that independent refineries in China plan to cut processing in April to around 50%, below the recent 55% precisely because oil became more expensive and domestic demand remained weak. At the same time, the Chinese government ordered a halt to new transportation contracts, fuel exports, and tried to hold back shipments that had already been agreed upon. Then, it expanded the export ban on gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. When a regime of this size holds back fuel at home, the message is clear. Beijing has entered damage control mode. Why is this so serious for Xi Jinping? Because the propaganda of the so-called fortress economy sold the idea of a system capable of withstanding external shocks without bending. But what the crisis showed was the opposite. China was not bombed, did not formally enter the war, and yet still saw costs rise, margins shrink, and confidence shaken. Reuters summed this up by showing that Chinese exports lost momentum in March precisely because of the energy shock and the global anxiety caused by the war. Exports grew only 2.5% while imports soared 20.8%, a scenario that puts pressure on the trade balance and erodes the sense of control. This shock didn't stop at oil. It started to spread to other critical sectors. One of the most delicate cases was helium, a gas essential for the manufacture of chips, medical equipment, and high-precision components. Reuters reported in March that the helium shortage, worsened by the interruption of part of the gas processing in Qatar, was already being felt. In some cases, spot prices have doubled. This is devastating for China because it hits precisely the area that she presents as the nation's future: semiconductors, advanced electronics, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and high-value industry. Without a stable supply, the rhetoric of self-sufficiency turns into emergency rhetoric. And when energy gets tight, the problem spreads like wildfire. It's not just the refinery that suffers. Petrochemical companies, automakers, electronics manufacturers, exporters, and workers all suffer. Reuters also reported today that the war has caused one of the worst recent disruptions in the global energy supply, with a sharp drop in demand in the short term and shutdowns at Asian refineries. Also this week, Reuters highlighted that aluminum went through a supply shock, like a black swan event, with prices reaching 4-year highs. This shows that the Iran crisis wasn't limited to oil. It spread to metals, shipping, insurance, and the entire industrial chain. Xi is still trying to react, but this reaction already seems improvised. Beijing rushed to use stockpiles, redistribute import quotas, hold back exports, and manage the political damage. There is indeed partial protection. Reuters showed that China has enough reserves to cover months of imports that normally go through Hormuz. But reserves buy time, they don't restore advantage. Reserves reduce panic, but they don't bring back the Iranian oil discount. Reserves help avoid immediate collapse, but they don't erase the harsher truth. The Chinese model became dependent on a cheap and vulnerable flow, too much so to keep being called a fortress without raising questions. There's still a second problem. It's quieter, and maybe even more dangerous for the regime. When China holds back exports, reduces refining, and starts working with a more expensive input, part of the pressure is exported to the rest of the world. This affects buyers, contracts, deadlines, and prices in other nations. What started in the waters near Iran hits supply chains far from there. Companies build up more inventory out of fear, cancel orders, renegotiate contracts, and look for alternative suppliers. In this scenario, China loses some of the appeal that kept China as the world's factory. If the buyer starts to see too much risk in Beijing, the damage stops being just temporary and becomes a strategic setback. That's why Xi Jinping was left powerless, without a clear answer. If he stimulates the economy too much, he risks driving up prices and worsening imbalances. If he holds back too much, the slowdown gets worse. The industry loses strength, and the rhetoric of absolute power loses its shine. In the end, the war is showing that China bet too heavily on cheap energy and an external network that seemed secure but wasn't. The result is clear: Beijing is exposed. And for a regime that built its strength on the image of total control, this exposure is already a brutal blow. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end, check out the comments so you can be even more engaged with the Milsenal community. Cheers!